A quiet night turns into a nightmare for a black man as he's pulled over by two cops who think they've got an easy target. But this time, things aren't going as planned. These officers, blinded by their own prejudices, set him up, believing they can frame him for a crime he didn't commit. What they don't know is that the man they're trying to destroy has a secret, one that could change everything. As the tension builds, the cops realize they've made a dangerous mistake. The tables start to turn, and suddenly, it's their futures on the line. Will the system protect the innocent, or will these racist cops get away with it? The clock is ticking, and everything is about to unravel. Stay tuned to see how this story unfolds, because the real shocker is just around the corner. The man James had always kept his head down, living quietly in a neighborhood where mistrust between the community and law enforcement was all too familiar. But tonight, things were different. As soon as the cops pulled him over, it was clear they were more interested in finding something to pin on him than in any actual wrongdoing. Officer Harris, known for his aggressive approach, smirked as he approached James's car. Officer Davis, the younger one, seemed eager to impress his partner. They threw out accusations without any real proof, scanning the car with a kind of suspicion only fueled by bias. James, though, wasn't nervous. He'd seen this kind of thing before, but he wasn't about to let them get away with it. What they didn't know was that James had been recording everything. Every word, every move, captured in real time. The cops had no idea they were already being watched. As the officers continued their questioning, James remained calm, maintaining eye contact and refusing to be intimidated. But behind the scenes, things were starting to unravel in ways the cops couldn't see. Officer Harris was growing impatient, his tone turning hostile as he demanded James step out of the car. He was hoping to find something, anything, that would justify his actions. Meanwhile, Officer Davis, unsure of what to do, glanced nervously at his partner. He had never been in a situation like this before. The tension between them was palpable, and the unease in Davis's eyes didn't go unnoticed by James. James knew that this wasn't just about a traffic stop. It was about the power these officers thought they had over him. But James wasn't just a victim here. He had been fighting a much bigger battle for years. Deep down, he knew this moment could be the one that changed everything. He wasn't going to let their biases take away his future. Back at the precinct, the pressure was mounting too. The internal politics between the officers were starting to surface. Harris was pushing for an arrest, eager to cover up his own mistakes, while Davis felt conflicted, questioning his own involvement in something that felt wrong. Both men were at a crossroads, and the longer they stayed on this path, the more their own futures became at risk. The minutes dragged on like hours. The air was thick with tension, every movement amplified under the harsh glow of the streetlights. Harris's patience was running out, and his frustration was becoming more evident. He leaned in close to James, his breath sharp and commanding, demanding to know where he had been, what he was doing. James stood his ground, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He knew they were looking for an excuse, any excuse, to escalate the situation. The small camera tucked in the corner of his dashboard quietly recorded it all, capturing every word, every movement, every threat. Meanwhile, Officer Davis shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. He wanted to do the right thing, but his loyalty to Harris and the badge he wore pulled him in the wrong direction. He kept glancing at the flashing red and blue lights, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how far this could go, but deep down, he knew this was no longer just about a simple traffic stop. The consequences for everyone were about to escalate in ways none of them had prepared for. Back at the precinct, word had started to spread about the altercation. Officers were whispering, unsure of how to handle the fallout. But Harris was too deep into it now, convincing himself that this was his moment to prove his authority. He turned to Davis, nodding to signal that it was time to make their move. But just as Harris reached for his radio, a car pulled up, its headlights slicing through the dark. The sudden noise broke the tension, and for a split second, it seemed like everything might shift. James knew this was the moment. The silence was deafening, but his hand was already reaching for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. The recording wasn't just a safety measure anymore, it was a weapon. And the more the officers pushed, the more they were digging their own grave. They didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. As the headlights of the car grew closer, James felt a shift in the air. Something was about to happen. The officers froze, both of them turning in unison, their eyes narrowing as the car came to a stop behind them. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped someone James hadn't expected to see. Detective Lawrence, an officer with a reputation for playing the system, stepped onto the scene, his gaze locking with Harris. "What's going on here, Harris?" Detective Lawrence's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it that immediately made James feel uneasy. Harris straightened up, trying to mask the tension in his posture, but his voice betrayed him. "Routine stop, sir. Just a small situation with this guy." Lawrence's eyes flicked toward James, a brief moment of recognition passing between them. James had seen Lawrence around, but never this close, never in a moment like this. Something wasn't right. The detective's presence here, so unexpectedly, sent a chill down his spine. "What's your name?" Lawrence asked James, his tone suddenly softer, almost calculating. "James," he replied, watching the detective's every move. The air between them felt charged, as if Lawrence knew something James didn't. Without another word, Lawrence reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small folder. The rustling of paper was sharp against the tense silence. The weight of the folder seemed to hang in the air, and for a split second, it felt like everything was suspended in time. "I think we have a problem here, Harris," Lawrence said, his eyes flicking back to the two officers with a knowing look. "A serious problem." James's heart raced as his mind whirred. The sudden appearance of Lawrence, the way he spoke, there was something deeper going on here. The stakes had just been raised in a way that James couldn't yet understand, but he felt it. The tension in the air was no longer just about him being framed. This was bigger than that. Just as Lawrence moved closer to Harris, the radio crackled to life. Another officer's voice echoed from the car. "Unit 12, we've got a situation on the east side. You need to head out now." The order was sharp, and before anyone could respond, Lawrence's gaze shifted back to James, this time with a glimmer of something far more dangerous. "We'll talk soon," he said, his voice low and almost menacing. As the detective turned and walked away, James stood frozen, his mind spinning. The situation had just taken a wild turn, and he could feel that the game was only just beginning. As Detective Lawrence walked away, a heavy silence lingered. James stood there, trying to process everything that had just happened. His hand still hovered over his phone, the recording of the entire interaction safely tucked away. He had expected the worst, the arrest, the lies, but not this. Not Lawrence's sudden appearance, the look in his eyes. Something had shifted. And now, with the officers distracted by the radio call, James realized this was his moment. He quickly pulled out his phone and sent the video to a trusted friend, someone who would know exactly how to handle it. Harris and Davis were still trying to regain their composure, their voices lowering as they exchanged words about the situation. But James wasn't going to wait around to find out what they'd do next. He turned to walk away, his step steady, but his mind racing. The final decision would come soon. Either they would cover up their mistake, or everything would blow wide open. Suddenly, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. James spun around, eyes wide, only to see another police car pulling up, this time with a new set of officers. One of them, a woman with sharp features and an air of authority, stepped out, walking straight toward him. James froze. "You, James?" she asked, her gaze intense. Before he could answer, she pulled out a badge. "We've been monitoring the situation. You're not in trouble. You're the key witness now." The words hit him like a shockwave. He looked around at the scene, the two cops still in disbelief, unsure of what was happening. The woman continued, her voice firm but not unfriendly. "We've been investigating Harrison Davis for a while now. They've been involved in several cases of police misconduct. You've just unknowingly helped us gather enough evidence to take them down." James's mind was spinning. He had been trying to protect himself, but now it seemed like the tables had turned in his favor. Just when he thought he was about to get dragged into something bigger than himself, the truth was finally coming out. But as the officers were handcuffed and led to the back of the squad car, there was one final twist. Detective Lawrence, who had disappeared earlier, suddenly reappeared at the scene, his eyes cold as he watched the officers being taken away. His lips curled into a tight smile as he locked eyes with James, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "You did well, James," Lawrence said, his voice low, but with an almost imperceptible tone of respect. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." James's heart skipped a beat. What was Lawrence's game? Why did he seem so calm, as if he knew something James didn't? The mystery wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As the officers were driven away and the scene began to clear, James was left with more questions than answers. The biggest one of all, what had Lawrence meant by that final statement? The story might have seemed resolved, but in the world they were all caught up in, nothing was ever truly finished. As the last police car drove away, the weight of everything that had just happened began to settle over James. He stood there, watching the flashing lights disappear into the night, his heart still racing. Detective Lawrence had slipped away, leaving James with more questions than answers. But he wasn't about to let fear control him. The evidence was clear now. Harris and Davis were done, their careers in ruins. They would face the consequences for what they'd done, and the system would finally have to answer for the broken trust it had allowed to fester. James knew the fight wasn't over. The encounter with Lawrence left him with a lingering unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of his story. But for now, he had won. The truth had come to light, and in a world that often buried it, that was something worth celebrating. The next morning, his phone buzzed with messages, news reports, and even calls from people in the community. James had exposed the darkness that so many had overlooked. He had stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone who'd ever been treated unfairly. The journey ahead would be uncertain, but for now, the truth was his weapon, and he was ready to wield it.